Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm George Mouse again here at allpointstv.com, and we're very glad to have you with us here at this studio and also WFOV, where we air on Saturdays at 12 o'clock in the afternoon. Want to thank Mr. Paul Herring over there at 92.1 WFOV, and also the Great Odyssey House is doing a great job in the community here in the city of Flint, and want to thank them for partnering with us here at allpointstv.com. And the program called What's Going On, that's taping at the regular time today, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, from 2 o'clock to 3. One day before the election that's held tomorrow, probably one of the most crucial elections that we've had in our lifetime. And I do not say that metaphorically, euphemistically. We are really heading toward one of the critical elections in this country, and we'll see what happens tomorrow if the predictions are true. One of the pundits is saying, one of the reports is that the House will probably swing to the Democrats, and the Senate will remain in the hands of the Republican Party. And if that would be true, then it's a split decision as far as how this comes out. As far as Donald Trump's leadership is concerned, it would be really devastating to the Democratic Party and might even be the death knell of that party if both houses are retained by the Republicans tomorrow. And we have both branches of the Congress in the hands of the Republicans, and also the president's in the hands of the Republicans, where there will be no doubt about the verdict of the American people and the direction in which they want to go, which is anti-socialism and pro-borders. The globalist direction this country is heading in before the election of 2016. If this is validated tomorrow, that the direction which this country is being taken by Donald Trump is really the direction that is in fact voted on tomorrow, without anyone having a doubt about the direction being voted on by both houses being retained by the Republican Party, then this country might have a shot at saving itself from the leftists who have, they said in this movie by Jack Nicholson, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, we have the whole political party on the national level. The Democratic Party has become cuckoo. I really don't. I don't even know why there would be these close elections. For example, in Florida, where you have Andrew Gillum, the Democrat, running against Ron DeSantis, the Republican. I don't even know why that race would be close. But they're running neck and neck. I don't think that Andrew Gillum will get it, but the mere fact it is close pretends a lot of problems for this country. They have these socialists, and that's what Gillum is. Gillum is obviously a communist. They're willing to come out on the socialist agenda, being endorsed by Bernie Sanders, but socialism is just the level of government interference on its way to communism. It's one level below communism, which is a complete takeover of the country by the government, and socialism is like a pathway to the end result. But it's just as bad as the ultimate result, because we look at it around the world and see where it has been critically a part of the downturn and the downfalls of governments all over the world, with Venezuela being the latest example. And you can go back through history and see other examples of the same thing, where socialism has not worked anywhere, has been applied anywhere in the world. And that's not going to change because of the internal mechanism of socialism, and where it does not incentivize production. So it'll always end up the same way, because it does not have the incentives built in that would encourage production and encourage creativity. So that's not going to change. And hopefully this country will vote for a sane course, because I got to tell you something, and this is not going to go over very well with the ones that watch this program, a lot of them that watch this program, and that is that the only sane person in Washington is Donald Trump. The other person up there with degrees of insanity are trying to pull, in particular those ones trying to pull in the opposite direction, these persons are virtually insane. I'm going to show today on this program some language that would indicate how insane the leadership in this country actually is. And much of it is because the leadership is not only insane, but to a large extent illiterate. But let me read, before I put this on the screen, let me read something from Ayn Rand, page 5. I'm going to read two excerpts from Ayn Rand in a book called For the New Intellectual. On page 5 of her book, Ayn Rand makes this profound statement. Our present state of cultural disintegration is not maintained and prolonged by intellectuals as such, but by the fact that we haven't any. In other words, the cultural disintegration that we see going on right now in America, and there's no doubt about the fact that we are imploding from within and that there's a cultural disintegration taking place, Ayn Rand is saying on page 5 of the book For the New Intellectual that it is not caused and prolonged and sustained by the intellectuals, but because we have no intellectuals. This is a continuation of the view that our first intellectuals and so far our last intellectuals are the founders of this country. She goes on to say on page 45, and I'll just read one sentence on this page. She says, if America perishes, it will perish by intellectual default. If this country falls, if it goes the way of Rome and other empires that are written about by such writers as Constantine Francis Volney, the French writer in the 18th century, wrote a book called The Ruins of Empire. If this country goes the way of the wind by other empires, the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, did I say the Persian Empire, that was at its hem in 525 BC. If this country goes the way of Rome, we saw it falling in 476, then it will be the result of the intellectual default of this country. And she's saying that a country cannot survive its intellectuals or the absence of intellectuals playing a dominant role in leading society out of whatever quagmire is in. And they have to show the leadership in terms of how we have problems resolved by the intellectuals thinking the problems clearly and solving it through the mind, the struggle of the mind. And since she's saying that we do not have that, and we don't have it for a number of reasons, one of which is that the intellectuals in this country, quote unquote, the intellectuals in this country, have been captured by the politicians. And because they need grants, they want grants, and they want to do their research, they need government grants, and therefore they're not allowed to a large extent to think outside the box. And that's why most of them, and I say most, not many, most of them sound like parrots.
Well, see, that's what I've always wondered too. If you look at our current situation in the United States, we have our creative group, in the West Coast. They're Hollywood. They pander to the government, basically. And it started. We saw that during during the wars, First and Second World War. They used the apparatus for propaganda. They just tapped into the talent pool there. See, it seems like, I'm a person who believes that an artist should, if they talk about artistic integrity, they should want to be free of restrictions so they could take aim at things they found to be vile or reprehensible or had to be addressed in society. But the thing is, these intellectuals in this country, like you just stated, depend on grants. And grants are coming from the government because they coerce and hold a gun to the rest of our heads, force the money out of us so they can hand it over to people who can make documentaries of how bad we are for resisting this attempt to enlighten the rest of us. Yeah. And it's like, I don't see how they can be honestly intellectual when they allow for this to happen all the time. And the Flint water crisis right here, locally, should demonstrate why we should trust government with more oversight over more things in our lives. But that message is lost on the left here. They look at you with blank faces when you bring that up.
John, there's such a default on the part of the intellectuals, and their default is almost 100%, just in the things that they allow to be promoted and not challenged. For example, I was saying last week, and I'm probably the only one that's saying it, that there is just one example of this now. It's multiple examples, but one example of the intellectual default is this notion, and you see how absurd it is, this notion that the Bill of Rights is contained in the Constitution, that there's a that there's a Bill of Rights in the Constitution of the United States. And all of the scholars, all of them, there's not one person, I don't know of another person in the country that has come out and said that there is no Bill of Rights in the Constitution. And there's not a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. It would be, it's absolute, you know what it amounts to? It's blasphemy. Think about this for a minute. The founders of this country had fought a revolutionary war against government. A specific government, to be sure. But they rose up against a specific government, the most powerful government at that time in the world, the British government. And then for them to come behind a revolutionary war where they fought against government and then claim that our rights come from government is blasphemy against the founders. That's an absurdity. The fact of the matter is when they added the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, December the 15th, 1791, with them adding the 11th Amendment to the Constitution in 1795. So the first 10 amendments are called the Bill of Rights. And the assumption there is that our rights come from the government. So then the Bill of Rights is the government assigning our rights to us. I keep coming back to this over and over again because of the absurdity. But let me read to you why that can't be true based upon the founding documents. The intellectual default in this country is almost comprehensive. It's almost 100%. For that absurdity to go across the desk of these persons that are supposed to be scholars of the Constitution, that's Jeffrey Toobin, that's Alan Dershowitz, that's Judge Napolitano, it's all of them. If you had a Bill of Rights in the Constitution, it would therefore, if that were the case, it would in fact cancel out the language found in the Declaration of Independence. I keep reading this because I need to keep drawing into the public mind what the Constitution says. And I'm not going to stay on this very long because we've covered this before, but I do want to reiterate the points made here. This is Thomas Jefferson writing in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So men and women, but men at that time, set government up so as to secure the rights that Jefferson said were inalienable rights, meaning rights that you're born with, natural rights, rights because you are a human being. Governments are set up, I'm talking about legitimate governments are set up to defend the rights that are inalienable. And those governments that are set up to secure the rights that are inalienable, they derive their just powers. That's a modification of the word powers. Their just powers from the consent of the governed. So this idea that there is a Bill of Rights in the Constitution will contradict that premise. And don't forget, the same ones, the same revolutionaries that wrote the Declaration of Independence, and don't forget there was a body that had to endorse the Declaration of Independence, although it was written by Thomas Jefferson on the Committee of Five, one of whom was John Adams, by the way, who was also on that committee. But 5 persons on that committee, and then they referred it out to the Continental Congress, and then they endorsed it with some changes in it. But this is what it was finally agreed upon. So the second paragraph of it was in fact agreed upon by the revolutionaries. They were still intact and carrying this idea forward. And later on, 11 years after writing this, they will in fact draw up the Constitution. And they'll say there, we hold these truths, after saying we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among which are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, these rights that you're born with, but you may not be strong enough to secure on your own. So to secure these rights, governments, therefore, are set up among men, and we have to say women. So as to secure these rights, we set government up that derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. And then 11 years later, when they drew up the Constitution, they said, we the people of the United States, that is, the revolutionaries are now writing a constitutional document. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain this Constitution. So you can see here, the idea was not to get rights from the government, but to secure the rights and make sure that government understood his role, because his role is to get his authority, his just powers from the consent of the governed. That's in our documents. And to say that there is a Bill of Rights in the Constitution is absolute nonsense. But they're all saying it. Everyone in the country is saying that. Well, and it's absurd to say that our rights come from the government. Well,
how many times you hear a public speaker, a public official say, this is a democracy I'll defend. This is a republic with a democratic form of governance. There's a difference, and you cannot make people see that difference. You cannot.
You can't make them see it, John, because of the intellectual default that's already occurred in this country. You know, when people say that they, meaning the elite, the ones that are running the country, the ones that are supposedly governing this country, supposedly governing it under the restraints placed upon it by the Constitution of the United States, and also with respect for what's written in the Declaration of Independence, people say they think we're stupid. That's not really true. They act upon the premise that we're stupid, and they continue to test that premise with the things that they do. They don't. It's no longer thinking that we're stupid. They're testing the premise of our stupidity, and they are convinced of the stupidity because there's nothing in the body politic that says otherwise. And I'm going to prove that in terms of something we're going to be reading later on, in terms of the document that we are confused about, the Constitution, and a provision in it I want to eventually put on the screen in a minute, that shows that they're testing our stupidity. Because what they're claiming, let me say this first, they're claiming that once you touch the soil of the United States and you have a child inside this country, the claim is that the person that is born in the country is, no matter what the status of the citizenship of their parents is, that they are citizens of the United States. And that's why Donald Trump is sending troops down to the border so as to stop them from touching into the soil of the United States, supposedly because of the language in the 14th Amendment. I want to put on the screen Section 1 of Amendment 14. And as you read it, I want to read it from the Constitution, so you won't think that which is on the screen is not found in the Constitution. And what you're reading there is Amendment 14, Section 1. And then I'll go back over and explain why the interpretation of the language by all of the intellectuals, quote unquote, that word intellectuals in quotation marks, because all of them have abdicated their intellectual responsibilities. I'll read it first, and then I'll tell you why they're wrong in what they're saying about this language, to show you the absurdity of it. Amendment 14, Section 1 says the following: all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the states wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or amenities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now let me explain what the confusion is of these quote-unquote scholars. And I'm going to say, before I say this, that they're wrong and I'm right. First of all, I want you to go back to the second sentence in the Section 1 of Amendment 14. It starts out with the words, no state. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or amenities of citizens of the United States. That's the first of a three-tiered compound sentence. This is a compound sentence. The next two parts of it are divisive by semicolons. But if you understand the first of the three clauses, and it has three clauses to it, and there's not a period there, but a semicolon, which shows that the second clause and the third clause are connected to the first part of the compound sentence. So therefore, you should understand it this way. When it says, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or amenities of citizens of the United States, therefore, each of the two clauses is to refer back to the idea of citizens of the United States. It doesn't repeat the word citizens, but it refers back to it because the sentence is ongoing and continuous. So when it says here in the second part of this clause, in the first clause of the compound sentence, when it says, and let me read where it picks up, nor shall any state deprive any person. You should read into it because it's assuming that you could follow the reading and understand the continuation of the sentence. It would read then, nor shall any state deprive any person who is a citizen of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person who is a citizen within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. If you understand that, then you understand that it's ridiculous for them to say that it's talking about any person born in the United States. is any person that is naturalized or a citizen. That's how it starts off, and it never puts a period at the end of that sentence. It puts semicolons there. Why? Because these were intellectuals here. And the intellectuals assume that persons that would read this would be intellectually gifted enough to be able to follow the line of reasoning. Okay, we're going to take a break. And we'll come back. Hopefully you'll come back in 4 minutes from WFOV 92.1. And we're very glad to have you with you. Hope you'll come back after 4 minutes during the break. But I hope you understand what I'm saying here. You see, if they had broken the continuity of the thought, if they had intended to break the continuity so that the rest of it would be independent of that of the first part, they would have put periods there. But they did not break the continuity of the thought. So every part of the other two clauses of the compound sentence would then refer back to the antecedent part of the sentence, which talks about citizens.
Well,
you see my point here, John?
Another thing I would say is right the first line: all persons born or naturalized. Well, if I were to see that first comer to that, to that document, I would have to raise my hand and say, what does naturalized mean? And that's spelled out too. And
yes.
And it's also was understanding naturalization, means there's an undergoing process. So being born, just because somebody's here presently, drops a kid here, has a child here, I don't see how that's qualified. That's a qualifying thing. If your parents were born here in generations ago, they're all here, then you're naturally a born citizen because your parents were both citizens, naturalized or native-born citizens. But just somebody visiting, that's ridiculous. I don't see where anybody would get that.
It's absurd on the face of it, and you can see the absurdity of it, because if you are made a citizen by being born in this country, then why did it take an act in 1924 called the ICA, the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, that made the Native American citizens of the United States? That provision in 1924 was passed after the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was passed in 1868. So if you are born here and your birth makes you a citizen automatically, then why didn't they do that for the Native Americans, who were the ones who were here first?
Another thing is, historically, we got the ideas of citizenship largely from the Romans. And they had two processes of having it. It was through jus sanguinis, means your blood, and through jus soli, which means born in the soil. Okay, so we have that. But the thing is that always citizenship was gained either through the service in the empire of the Romans, as the legions and as the legionnaire or whatever, and you gained rank, and you also gained your citizenship, or you could purchase it. But the children born to people who are just enslaved or just passing through were not considered citizens. People who living in territories they conquered were not citizens, and they could have horrific things put upon them by the Roman government. So that's what the thing is. I mean, if you want to look at the predecessors that we drew from, they didn't say merely born on the soil. It was being born on the soil through parents who are also Roman citizens. So that's exactly what our founders drew from when they drew up our documents.
Yeah, I want to say this about the distinction to be made between natural born and naturalized. In order to get a full understanding of it, you have to go back to the naturalization acts of the first one passed in 1790. This is 1 year before the ratification of the first 10 amendments. Then there was a naturalization act in 1795, another one in 1798. In 1790, okay, well, I see them coming back now from WFOV, and we're glad to have you back. We're not very far away from where you were when you left, so we're not. What we're saying now, you can follow from what we were saying before you left for your 4-minute break. In 1790, the Naturalization Act tried to codify what was meant by natural born, because only natural born citizen can run for president of the United States. So in 1790, if you go read the Naturalization Act of 1790, they tried to clarify what it meant by natural born by going to this idea of by blood and by soil. But in 1795, they dropped the idea of by blood. And I tell you why they dropped that, because that would have been an amendment of the intention of the natural birth citizenship, as opposed to natural born, as opposed to naturalization. Natural born would not be by blood. Natural born would be by soil. And I'll tell you why that's true. That's true because one of the things that the founders were afraid of was that they were afraid of dual allegiance. They were afraid of treason. And if you can read the document carefully, you'll see in it that there were two things that the Constitution was written to guard against. One is government going out of control. The other one was the people in government creating treason against the country, and therefore they wanted to guard against those two things. Therefore, the idea of natural born being by blood, that is to say your parents were citizens born in the country, that would be their citizenship. But if the children were born outside the country under another flag, they wanted to guard against that. They had the right to naturalization, but they were not natural born. And they made it very clear that in their, if you go back and read the Naturalization Acts of 1790, 1795, and 1798, you'll see that they dropped this trying to define it as naturalization, because they realized that what the framers had intended in writing natural born, they wanted to make a distinction. Natural born would be those that are born inside of the confines of the United States, not those born outside. And so it is by birth on the land. Why? Because if you're born outside the country, there would be, as it was in Ted Cruz's case, it would be dual citizenship, which he had up until the time that he decided that was a problem. And so he disavowed his citizenship in Canada. And he said that he was disavowing that in order to have his citizenship pledged completely for the United States. That's not allowed by the Constitution. Natural born means soil.
So I admit I learned something today, because I didn't know about the other times, they tried to
amend it.
So I didn't know that. I mean,
and John, the reason why they took the language out of 1790 in the Naturalization Act of 1795 is because they understood you cannot amend the Constitution through an act of the Congress. That's why they took it out. They had it in there in 1790. They took it out in 1795. Because they understood that they could not amend the Constitution and make a claim against it unless they amended to put that language in there. And that never has happened. Natural born means born in the United States. And it also does not mean born in the Panama Canal, which is owned by the United States as of 1903. It does not mean that either, because there were no provinces this country had and no empire that this country claimed at that time when this document was in fact ratified. Therefore, it cannot be inclusive of the provinces or the territories that were outside the confines of the 13 states.
I don't think our founders actually wanted us to have territories.
They did not want us to have it, nor did they want to have an empire.
Because that's what exactly Pat Buchanan. By the way, Patrick Buchanan turned 80 last week. I don't know if you caught that.
Okay.
He turned 80 years old. But he said that in his book. It's a republic, not an empire. And you can think people like, and I'm pretty sure I'm right on the timeline, that was expanded. We had an expansion, but after the Spanish-American War, under Teddy Roosevelt and all this stuff, we had an expansion of America's boundaries into like these. Basically, we created third world countries so we could exploit them.
Yes.
I mean, that's what we were appalled about being done by the Brits. ourselves. And we turned around and did exactly the same thing.
Yes, the Spanish-American War was 1898. When we fought it was in 1803 where we annexed after having the French and Indian War. You know, that war was fought between, and it depends on which country you want to date it from. In this country, it's dated from 1756 to 1763. The 7-Year War, or the French and Indian War, is dated in France 1754. So they would have the war lasting 9 years. But after the French and Indian War, the war that we fought with the French, we were, because the French also had a problem in Haiti, because of the revolt that was led there by Toussaint Louverture that had risen up against the French in the French war with the Haitians, the slaves. When that war was enjoined in 1799, because they had to pay for that war, they ceded the territory, Louisiana territory, which they probably couldn't have held anyway, given the fact they had a war with Haiti, their most prolific colony. They didn't want to lose that, and they were going to lose this anyway in terms of the Louisiana territory. So they sold it to the United States for 4 cents an acre. It's really a steal, but it added 900,000 square miles of territory to the United States. There were colonists that objected to that. You're talking about the empire; they objected to that because the Constitution was drawn up with 13 states, and they thought what would happen is it would discombobulate the arrangement of the 13 states and cause problems in terms of expanding of the states inside of the Union. So they didn't want that because they had written the document said, "We the people of the United States." Now you're adding territories. And there were states, by the way, led by Massachusetts, they were talking about succeeding because they thought it would break up the compromises in place that led to the ratification of the Constitution. And there were secessionists talking about succeeding because of what Thomas Jefferson had done in adding that territory to the United States. And it was added, by the way, by Thomas Jefferson, the great Thomas Jefferson, the great philosopher Thomas Jefferson. I didn't say great president, but great philosopher. He was a great philosopher. And they were objecting what Thomas Jefferson had done and were threatening to secede from the Union because of him unconstitutionally bringing these territories into the United States and discombobulating the agreement that they had come up with the Constitution based upon the 13 states. We don't know how this would undo the agreement. And that was what they felt threatened by. What would that do to the arrangement between, first of all, the large states and small states, the slave states and the states that didn't have slaves, the states that were in the Union, and now those, if you bring other states into the Union that were not in it when they ratified the Constitution, how would that in fact discombobulate the document they put in place in 1787 and ratified in 1788? And now Jefferson is bringing territories in there that were not there at the founding of the country. They're concerned about that. And the secession movement starts in the New England states. Not in the southern states, but started in the New England states. And there was a very big rift going on to calm the waters by adding that territory. But no, they intended to have natural born mean one thing and naturalized being a different thing. So natural born was soil issue. Naturalization, they would be naturalized citizens by blood, but not natural born citizens. See, that's a distinction that has been made by these quote unquote scholars. They're not intellectuals, they're scholars, they're parrots. Naturalization would be they're naturalized citizens because their parents are citizens. That's naturalization. But they're not privy to becoming president. Why? Because naturalization and natural born are two different things. And Alan Dershowitz will not say anything behind that. And if he does, then he doesn't know anything about the Constitution. The Constitution does not allow someone that is born outside the country to run for president of the United States. And that includes Ted Cruz and that included John McCain. Neither one of them was eligible.
I remember years ago, Orrin Hatch they introduced legislation to amend the Constitution to allow for foreign-born people to be run as president because he was enamored with Schwarzenegger's celebrity. Now, Schwarzenegger did get elected as governor. And let's face it, anybody who wants to advocate for allowing people from outside our country to run our country, look what Jennifer Granholm didn't do for Michigan, okay? She was born and raised in Canada. I mean, we let a Canadian run our state. I mean, that's just absurd. Would we be allowed to go into Montreal or any other state, Providence of Canada, and get elected in an office there? I doubt it. Sincerely doubt it. But I mean, we're tolerant. But yeah, you're right there. I mean, there's a difference between naturalized and natural born.
Yes, and I'm right and they're wrong. I'm the only one. I think I'm the only person in the country. Certainly, I haven't seen anybody on the airwaves that are saying nobody said there's no Bill of Rights in the Constitution except me, and there are no scholars that are making a distinction between what naturalization means by those who are born to the parents of people who are natural-born citizens. They are naturalized because they're born outside the country. But by blood, they're tied to their parents, and therefore they're naturalized citizens. But they're not natural-born citizens. That is a soil question. And it's a soil question because the Constitution is written thematically. The Constitution has two concerns, as I said earlier. One concern is that the bully, the government, which becomes potentially a bully, that the bully will go out of control. Therefore, they took steps to prevent that, divide power up, and have each one assigned to a certain corridor of power. That would limit them in any branch doing things that's not inside of their purview. The legislative branch will make the law. It will not, in fact, enforce it. They will make the law, and then you put another branch there, the executive branch, and have them have the executive branch and its departments to enforce the law. So that lawmaking, then law enforcement, and then a third branch would, in fact, interpret the law so that the other two would have an understanding of what the Constitution requires. Neither one having the right to decide how the other parties would do their job, each one having their specific constitutional responsibility to do their job, not the job of the other two branches. To, in fact, constitutionally make the law, then enforce the law, and then interpret the law. And of course, the Constitution needs to be interpreted by what's written in the Constitution. And if it's not in there, if the court is in fact interpreting that which is not in the Constitution, then that's not the responsibility of the judiciary. The judiciary cannot make law. Make law is Article 1. Article 3 is to interpret the law, not to make law. If they start to make law, then you go back to what was said by Andrew Jackson in the Chester versus Georgia case. In don't tell me, case came up in 1832 and the court ruled upon it in 1833. In the Worcester versus Georgia case, which was the case of Georgia taking the side the Native Americans being removed is what it amounts to. And the court made a ruling that was not within the purview of the court. And that's when Andrew Jackson said, in that, when they tried to rescind the Worcester versus Georgia case, which was a states' rights case, by the way, that's when Andrew Jackson said, Marshall, meaning John Marshall, who was the head of the Supreme Court from 1801 to 1835, that's when Andrew Jackson said, Marshall has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. And why did he say that? Because the enforcement of the law is not the Supreme Court. The court has to interpret the law. And what they're trying to do is make law here. And Jackson said that Marshall has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. because and he did not follow the court because the court was outside of his orbit in making that ruling. I'll give you another example of the court being out of its element. You take the way the 14th Amendment is being interpreted by the court. Go back and read the slaughterhouse cases of 1873. By the way, that was the first time that the court had used the 14th Amendment to interpret civil rights. It had never been applied before, although the 14th Amendment was added to the Constitution in 1868. It had never been applied before. In the slaughterhouse cases of 1873 was the first application of the 14th Amendment. But the court in 1873 said that the 14th Amendment, and I wish it had stuck to this, the 14th Amendment gives two tiers of citizenship. It first of all assigns citizenship on the federal level. Let me read that again, the 14th Amendment. No state, it says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. Listen to this carefully now, and of the states wherein they reside. So when the Supreme Court interpreted the 14th Amendment in the slaughterhouse cases, it said that there is a two-tiered citizenship in the 14th Amendment, recognizing citizenship as citizens of the United States and citizenship in terms of the states in which they reside. Therefore, when the case was appealed about the slaughterhouse cases, where they were saying that those that were in the slaughterhouses slaughtering animals, they were saying that the 14th Amendment applied to them, and here's the state limiting their right, I think it was in Louisiana, limiting their right to slaughter animals because the offal was contaminating the waters. When the waters in the river would rise, the offal would get into the waters, and therefore the state tried to restrict the slaughterhouses in Louisiana, and the slaughterhouse industry, the people there took it to court and said this is a violation of our due process rights under the Constitution. The Supreme Court, looking at a limitation of how the 14th Amendment read, said that the states, the citizenship inside the states has something to say about this, and therefore to appeal the verdict of the states under the provision of the federal government due process does not apply to the case, because the states have the right to their mandate, because the citizenship is also inside the states. If it had stuck to that, you would have not had the problems you have right now in terms of the voice of the states being silent, because the states have something to say about federal law also, because the laws also go into the states. And the question is, how does that verdict play out in terms of the state requirements? Well, now we have the 14th Amendment being read so that the state's voice has been silenced. So now the federal government has no check upon its authority. But that's not the first time the 14th Amendment was ruled upon. And the 14th Amendment was ruled upon by the court in slaughterhouse cases in 1873. They ruled that the federal government could not intrude in terms of state law, in terms of the states passing laws within its own jurisdiction. That's states' rights there. But that's no longer the case, and so we now have the application of that language. But first of all, it was a very limited reading of the 14th Amendment. Another point to be made. The slaughterhouse cases had it right, and beyond that, they now have it wrong, where the state's voice has been canceled out, and now the federal government is unrestrained by the states. Never the intention of the framers. That was never their intent. The framers never intended to have the federal government having the largest voice inside of the structure. They operate upon the federal level. The states have the right to mandate things within the state. Although there now it doesn't apply, because now the federal government authority supersedes that of the states, and they don't have any authority to say otherwise. But that was not the premise inside the Constitution. Certainly wasn't the ruling of the court in 1873. Now let me say something about this present problem that we have, immigrants coming into the country. Donald Trump is right in sending the army, the military, down to the border. But the reason why he's doing that is because of a false reading of the 14th Amendment. You're not a citizen when you don't have rights under the Constitution when you touch the soil of the United States. You don't have due process inside the United States. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. The subject is citizens of the United States. Then there's a semicolon. Nor shall any state deprive any person. But any person meaning what persons are they referring to? Any citizen. Any person who's a citizen of the United States. Nor deprive any person who's a citizen of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Nor deny to any person who's a citizen, I'm going back to that word citizen in that first part of that sentence, within his jurisdiction, the equal protection of the laws. The subject is citizens of the United States, and it refers back to that, thinking you can follow the line of thought. It is not any person inside the United States. They don't have due process of law. And there was one guy last week on TV that was arguing because the caravan, and by the way, this is a caravan. I don't know what the caravan, the caravan usually is somebody that's doing, what was a caravan? They're bringing goods and offering services in the caravan, and they are selling their wares to a country. This is not a caravan, these are invaders. But they're saying that because they're headed in this direction, they're now coming toward the United States, folks, and because they're heading in this direction, there was one guy, a lawyer, arguing that because they're heading in this direction, they have immunity laws under the Constitution. They have protections under the Constitution because they're heading here. They haven't even hit the soil yet, but because they intend to get here, the Constitution protects their due process rights, although they have not yet arrived here. So because they're coming here, they have constitutional rights. This is the buffoonery that we have. No wonder Ayn Rand said on page 5, no wonder she said on page 5, our present state of cultural disintegration is not maintained and prolonged by intellectuals as such, but by the fact that we haven't any. On page 45, she says this, if America perishes, and that's a growing possibility, it will perish by intellectual default. She goes on to say in that paragraph, there is no diabolical conspiracy to destroy it. She's not saying there are not conspiracies out there. She's saying there is no diabolical conspiracy that can destroy it. No conspiracy could be big enough and strong enough to destroy this country from outside or from within. It cannot be big enough. If this country is going to be destroyed, it's going to be destroyed by intellectual default.
You can see, like, I don't know if you know who he is, Frank Zappa. He was a musician and composer, oddball personality, and he talks, and I can't remember the exact quote, but he said, years ago we used to have a class in school called civics, and that's where they taught you your rights, where your rights were. Now you don't teach them that. Let's face it, they don't. They do. They certainly. If they try to, they'll say, well, it's up to the government to give you your. Actually, I've seen some of the wording on some of the paperwork people have photographed and put out there on the internet, and it's like, oh, the government, our rights come from the government. They actually say that now in our government classes now. So he's right though. We basically The thing is because of apathy and apathy. I mean, basically, I don't want to get my blood pressure up. I don't want my kid to be mean or hateful towards others. So we'll just let this slide. And that's what happens.
John, if we get our rights from the government, since all politicians are Attila, and that again goes back to Ayn Rand's For the New Intellectuals in this book. If we get our rights from the government, what if you have Attila that takes advantage of the Constitution being in exile, which is what Napolitano is writing about in his book called The Constitution in Exile? What happens if if Attila gets in there and just simply casts the Constitution to the wind and announce that the government is no longer beholden to the Constitution? I mean, that is the state that we're in right now, but they have not yet come out and said that this document no longer applies. But what if that happens? If the government gives us our rights, then if it behooves the government then, or the politicians, because that's what we talk about when we talk about government, if it behooves the government to take the rights from us, then government can in fact do that because our rights come from the government. That's so dangerous as a premise, and is antithetical to the documents of this country, both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. Donald Trump put those troops on the border and stopped them from coming into this country, and those that are in this country have no due process rights under the Constitution. You have the right to, in fact, through a mandate, through a presidential mandate, to, in fact, end birthright citizenship. There's been no court case on it, and it does not allow for it in the Constitution. You heard it from George Moss. That's the truth and nothing but the truth. I'm right, and they're wrong. Until next week, we want you to follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.